Now, the government has announced a major overhaul of the family courts in order to better protect victims of domestic violence. The announcement comes after a review into how the courts operate following an investigation by BBC reporter Emma Ailes. And Emma is with us now. Emma, take us through what the review was looking into and what did it find?
So the review was looking at whether victims of domestic abuse were being properly protected in cases that come before the family courts, and in particular in cases where a judge is deciding contact between a parent and child. Now, our investigation last year on the Vitoria Derbyshire programme found that at least 4 children had been killed by a parent with a known history of domestic abuse within the space of 5 years after a court had granted contact. And we also learned of cases where a parent with criminal convictions, often for serious offences, including rape, violent offences and child sex abuse, were granted unsupervised overnight contact with their children. After our investigation, the government announced this review, and today we have the findings. And it's highlighted concerns that abuse has been systematically minimised and allegations ignored, dismissed or disbelieved in the family courts. It also heard criticisms about what it calls a pro-contact culture, so courts unduly prioritising contact between a parent and child, and perpetrators in some cases being given unrestricted access to children. It also described an adversarial system, so parents often pitted against each other in court, including in cases where there are allegations of domestic abuse, and parents often unrepresented because legal aid often isn't available to people looking for representation in the family courts. And it heard that for victims of domestic abuse, this system, this adversarial nature of the system could be re-traumatising. And furthermore, it raised concerns that where parents were trying to report allegations of continuing and ongoing abuse by a perpetrator, these were often dismissed by professionals working in the field if there was already a court contact order in place.
So, Emma, the government says it's introducing what it calls sweeping reforms. What are those?
So, amongst other things, the government has announced that victims of domestic abuse will now have a legal entitlement to special measures in the courts. Now, this means separate entrances to courtrooms, separate waiting rooms, screens in courts to shield victims from the perpetrator. And that was available in many courts already. However, it will now be included in the domestic abuse bill, and there will be a legal requirement for victims to be entitled to that. The upcoming domestic abuse bill also bans cross-examination of victims by the perpetrator in the family courts. And also included in the recommendations from this review are further powers for judges in the form of barring orders, which will stop perpetrators repeatedly dragging their ex-partners back to court, which is sometimes used as a way of continuing abuse. On the issue of the so-called pro-contact culture, the government's announced a further review of the system, so to look at the balance between safeguarding children and the presumption of contact between a parent and child. So we'll hear more about that in the future. There's also a trial that's been announced of new domestic abuse courts. They're described as problem-solving courts where a judge explores evidence rather than parents having to pit cases against each other. And this review has been welcomed by many working in the domestic abuse field, including by the most senior judge of the family courts, Sir Andrew McFarlane. He's welcomed the findings and the recommendations, but he's also called on Parliament to provide the resources necessary to make these changes.
OK, Emma, thank you very much for taking us through that. Emma Ailes. Well, let's talk now to the Justice Minister, Alex Chalk. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So what's going to happen quickly in terms of these changes and what might take a bit longer?
Yeah, so as Emma indicated, as a result of this report, which, by the way, is fantastic in its scope, and I pay tribute to those who've contributed to it, we want within the domestic abuse bill, which is already going through Parliament, we're going to amend that bill at report stage, so the final stage that goes through the House of Commons, to ensure that perpetrators cannot cross-examine victims, as was already indicated. Also special measures, so that might be screens, it might be live link for individuals to give their evidence, so that people who do need to use the courts to achieve a just result for their families, for their children, aren't necessarily going to see the courts as an instrument to continue and perpetrate that abuse. That's what we want to create. We want to create a system which is focused absolutely on getting to the justice of the case and does not re-traumatise victims of this horrendous crime of domestic abuse.
The most senior judge in the family courts in England and Wales has welcomed this report, but also said he hoped the Parliament would allocate the necessary resources to implement these reforms. And there's also that issue around legal aid. Given the adversarial nature of these courts sometimes highlighted in this report, if people don't have access to legal aid, it means they are more likely to end up having to represent themselves and encountering this adversarial system. So what resources, what new funding will the government allocate to deal with those concerns?
Well, look, we are absolutely committed to ensuring that victims of domestic abuse receive the financial support that is required. So, I don't think any fair-minded observer could suggest that there hasn't been a huge amount of money that has been put during this coronavirus outbreak, some £76 million or so. But also the domestic abuse bill itself will have 30 plus million attached to it to ensure that victims get the support that is required. Also, it's important to note that those who are victims of domestic abuse can themselves access legal aid subject to means testing, which is a threshold, and we are looking again at what steps can be taken to increase that means test threshold. We'll be reviewing that in due course. So look, we are absolutely committed to stand behind victims of domestic abuse. That's why we brought in the domestic abuse in the first place. It's why we legislated to outlaw coercive control. It's why we introduced stalking prevention orders and so much stuff to transform the landscape for victims of this appalling crime.
OK, Alex Chalk, Justice Minister, thank you very much. We can get reaction to all of this now from Jess Phillips, the Shadow Minister dealing with domestic abuse and safeguarding, and from Claire Waxman, who is the Victims Commissioner for London. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. Jess Phillips, your reaction to what Alex Chalk was just saying there?
Are you speaking to me? Your sound just cut out, I'm afraid.
Yes, I am. Yes. Jess Phillips, that question is for you, please. Reaction to Alex Chalk.
Yes, so, look, Alex has been in the job for quite a short period of time, and nobody could deny that I think he is committed to ensuring this. What we have to make sure going forward is that we act swiftly on the recommendations. So, as Alex said, as the Minister said, that we will put some of this into the domestic abuse bill. Just last week, I was seeking amendments exactly saying this to the domestic abuse bill, and I'm glad to hear that special measures will now be in it, even though that had been turned down last week, waiting for the review. But with regard to the pro-contact culture, that is the absolute key in this to stop some of the terrible cases that Emma was referring to with regard to child deaths post-contact being granted. Any review on that, on the presumption of contact between, in lots of cases, a convicted violent partner and their children, that must be done very, very swiftly, because this review itself was launched 14 months ago on a 3-month timetable, and we have got to make sure that that happens quickly, because children's lives are hanging in the balance. But I very much welcome the review, and I welcome the government's response to it.
And Claire Waxman, I know you've welcomed the review as well, but that issue around contact, that presumption of contact, that it should be there between the parents, even where, as it's turned out, as Jess Phillips was just saying, one of those parents is violent. You are worried that has been pushed into further review, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely. And I echo what Jess has said. I mean, this is an excellent report. It validates what we've been hearing from victims and survivors of domestic abuse being dragged through those family court proceedings for many years. So I do welcome a number of the recommendations, but I am very concerned that there's going to be a further review when Jess and I both know, because we hear from those victims on a daily basis, that them and their children are being put at risk today and every day, risk of harm and trauma. So we really need to move very quickly. And I think the domestic abuse bill is a perfect opportunity. We should not be allowing parental responsibility or contact with those who have convictions or subject to restraining order where it's been proven in the criminal courts that they pose a serious risk of harm to that individual and the child. So we do need to take swifter action on that.
Okay, Claire Waxman and Jess Phillips, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on that this morning.